Hey everybody, this is Perch. How are you doing? I've had better days. Anyway, enough about that. Um, that's a story for another day or days or whatever. So a number of you sent me a tweet from Mags. This video has nothing to do with Mags. So this is not a Mags video. It doesn't have anything to do with anything about Mags. Mags wrote something that I've heard repeated from other people in regards to comic books, and in particular, creators that are later found to get involved in bad stuff. And she wrote, "I really do think that the young Gaiman, Neil Gaiman, was very much aware of his darker temptations and knew enough to try and exercise them through his work. The Dream King is so obviously him, and Gaiman is unsparing about Morpheus's flaws and failures and crimes. And then he became Neil Gaiman." This she goes on with a little bit more in the thread, but basically what she's getting at is this idea of, does it? I basically, I'm paraphrasing Mags's words. I really like Neil Gaiman's work. Can I keep liking it? Because he was working through things back then, and then he turned out to be a rotten person, but does that change before? And I can't look at it the same way. And then there's something in there of Mags writes something like, again, I'm paraphrasing, I don't mean to center this on Neil when it should be about the victims. And as an aside, there's that's such a dumb thing. I'm not picking apart the words, but I just hate that whole like, oh, should we center it on Neil? What should we do? And yes, you should center this on Neil. This isn't about the victims. The whole idea of don't, it's whether you talk about the perpetrator or the victims is if you're saying, man, I really feel bad for how all this went down. You save your sympathy and your sorrow for the victims. When you're discussing somebody's behavior, you center it on the perpetrator. It's not that hard. There's something in there that bothers me a lot because it kind of is this whole, I want to erase the person, Neil Gaiman. I want to erase Neil from existence because, he did this bad thing, so we can't even talk about him. He's he who shall not be named. And that's not the right way to address these things. More importantly, it's not the right way to get past them or to prevent them from happening again. There's a certain kind of sick thing that goes on in comics, and I mean this with a lot of passion. There's a sick thing that goes on in comics where people will, kind of quickly gloss over. They're like, this man is an awful man. This person is a bad person. We will not talk about this person again. We will feel bad for their victims, and then we will move on. Except the behaviors exist beyond one person. And so there's a bit of self-protectionism when you just make it about a guy, because it's kind of in a weird way, it's like saying, well, this doesn't exist anywhere else but this one guy. And the reality is, the arts, movies, music, comics, this stuff goes on more than it should, more than in other parts of life. And it goes on that way because, in part, people excuse it. They excuse it in many different stages. They excuse it as being, well, creative people are just a little quirky. They confuse it in saying, well, creative people can't have too many rules because if there are too many rules, they won't be creative. They excuse in the sense of like, well, it's colorful characters. It's just, they're larger than life. And we tend to take people from the media, movies, music, comics, other places, and we turn them into little mini celebrities. There's plenty of people who have as much power and make as much or far more money than people in comics. But they don't get to be celebrities. So when they fall or they falter, there is no excuse around like, well, can you blame them? They had all these groupies and other things. It's something sick and wrong about comics. And I see this happen again and again. And I really hope I'm making a good, an important point here to all of you, because I think it's a really critical one, which is if you, by turning these people into bigger than life characters, by, doing all this like, well, art is quirky and art has got to be, free from limits and all that kind of stuff. You have to understand that good people will take those, that energy, and they will create wonderful pieces of art, unrestrained, amazing pieces of art. And bad people will use it as an excuse to do shitty things. And it's not blaming comics, it's not blaming movies, it's not blaming the media, but it is blaming the idea that, when you give people creative control and you say they don't have to live by the same rules as, the guy who works in the auto shop or the person who's an investment banker. When you do that, you open up the door for bad actors, bad people to abuse it. And they do over and over and over and over and over again. And so that's a little bit why, as I've done videos and I've talked about the various people in comics that have done this shit, it's that the real symptom is the industry and the people involved in it and how they treat and behave within it. That is the real symptom. It is not, this is a Neil Gaiman problem. This is a Warren Ellis problem. This is, on and on it goes. Yes, those people did bad things. And none of what I'm saying, I hope none of you are hearing right now an excuse. There's no excuse for these guys in what I'm saying. None at all. But by making it just about them, you are just setting it up for the next to them, the next person, the next, because you're not actually doing the things that other businesses have that would start to kind of, stop this behavior from continuing. But regardless, back to the tweet that Mags wrote. And again, this is something lots of people have said. So this is not a unique perspective from Mags. I guess, my point is this. I do not prescribe and do not believe that if somebody does something shitty, that, you have to immediately take all of their past work and throw it into the toilet. It is actually more about you than them. If you've bought a comic, it's a little bit of a different case if you really want to get into like, well, if I buy something from them, then am I giving them royalties and am I funding their legal defense? Or I don't know. Yes, these are also important questions, but the real part of all this is not, what did they do? It's what are you reading? What are you consuming? And does it bother you? In other words, this is a you choice far more than anything else. I think that, where Neil is concerned, I think you can read the Sandman, guilt-free. Unless you happen to be Neil's nanny or lawyer or confidant or whatever it happens to be, and unless you knew that he was up to this and you bought the comic and enjoyed it anyway, you can't retroactively go back and alter kind of how you feel about something back in the past. Now, your current readings, it may not work the same. You may look at this comic and you may go, hey, I can't separate the art from the artist now. I see it's clearly Neil here, dressed up like Morpheus. It's clearly like, I can't unsee it. Okay. That's also perfectly valid. But again, that's your choice. That has nothing, it's weird to say it this way, but that it doesn't have as much to do with him as it does with you. If you read the comic book, you read Sandman, and you just, I don't think about Neil Gaiman. I'm looking at this character, I'm looking at everything else. Then you should continue to do that. You should do it without concern. If you read it and you're like, yeah, but this guy is a creep and he did this and that and all the rest, then you should stop reading it. Again, it's about you. It's about you as the consumer of the art. Because quite frankly, and this again, kind of weird to wrap your head around, but right now you are watching movies, listening to music, doing all kinds of things out there where the creator of that stuff that you're consuming is a terrible person. Hate to say it, but it is a 100% safe bet that something you have watched, listened to, consumed, read, whatever, somebody involved in that project was doing some really shitty stuff and, hasn't been caught. Does that, can you preemptively stop enjoying it? Of course not. Should you be wary of all the media you consume? Of course not. Although, if the media is leading you to believe certain things that you know are morally wrong, then yeah, you should probably, cut that shit out. But the reality is, you can dislike Neil Gaiman, and he's done plenty of things that you should dislike him. Beyond just being a massive hypocrite, he was a terrible person to lots of people. And for what it's worth, a lot of those stories had been going on for a while, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't enjoy his work. Because when I read it, in the back of my head, I was like, yeah, I've heard too many stories. I've heard too many stories from credible people that it just doesn't, I have a hard time, getting really behind this guy's work. I'm sure a lot of people said the same thing about Gerard. But once you know, then it becomes your call. Are you able to, and so this kind of wishy-washy, what I did dislike about the tweet was the idea of like, well, he was clearly trying to exercise his demons through his work. Yeah, that sounds like a very poetic, artsy way to describe something, but it almost, when you read it that way, it almost feels like person's trying to like, there's a lot of really awful people in the media and the arts, and then they try and work out their demons through their work, and some just can't get there, and it's like, the other thing you could do is just not do that shitty stuff. I think it's a massive cope to try and assume that people who are lousy are, well, they tried their best at getting it out through the art, but then they just couldn't help but succumb to their demons. I mean, the other thing you could do is, have a good fear of the law, have a good fear of, going to jail, have a little bit of moral compass to know that things you're doing are wrong. I think it's a very romantic notion to say things like, well, a lot of artists will work out their bad things through the art. I mean, yeah, okay. They could also not do those bad things. And I understand about compulsions and I understand about everything else, but it does start to feel a little bit like an excuse over time. I mean, the biggest thing that should have prevented Neil from doing what he's doing was it was morally abhorrent what he was doing. And in addition to that, not, I mean, illegal in some countries. Absolutely not anything that should happen. So, I think that whether you enjoy the art or not really is up to you. It really is. And I think you get to make that call. You get to know what bothers you or doesn't bother you. You get to make these choices. It really is about you. And I don't think you shouldn't feel guilty or bad if you, if you just, yeah, hey, I still like what I like. That's okay. It's okay. Now you should recognize, of course, the person is terrible, but it is okay to like what you like in any form or in any fashion. And it is okay that while you're liking things, you also say, yeah, and I think that what this guy was doing was really, really wrong. Both things can be true. We are complex human beings who can form complex thoughts. Both can be true. Anyway, I suspect some of you will have different opinions, and I'm open to hearing all of them. So let me know in the comments below, and thanks for listening.